Here we are, spring's in the air. The birds are gathering nesting material. A few more weeks, and we'll see what happens. Now, there are things that happen that can be quite extraordinary, beyond comprehension, and more importantly, beyond belief. I mean, obviously, comprehension and belief are at opposite ends of the spectrum. So when you see a war criminal being feted by the leadership of the land of the brave and the free, you begin to ask yourself questions. Now, we expect Vladimir Putin, who's been designated a war criminal by the International Court of Justice in The Hague, to be welcomed by the totalitarian regimes in China and North Korea. But did people expect a war criminal designated by the International Court of The Hague, not me or you, the supreme United Nations legal body, to be feted as some type of conquering hero by Mr. Biden, Ms. Harris and Mr. Trump? One of these will be the leader of the USA for the next 4 years. Well, Mr. Biden won't, but the other two will. And also to be given the privilege of addressing the Senate and the Congress, a combined sitting of the Senate and the Congress of the United States. Now, a lot of people speak about the war in Gaza, and most people think that it all started on the 7th of October 2023. But the fact is, there's a 75-year history of occupation, destruction, that goes back at least 75 years, since the creation of the State of Israel. Now, what I've always found puzzling, beyond comprehension and beyond belief, is that it's the Palestinians who are paying the price for the atrocities which were committed by the Nazis in Germany and many other regimes in Western Europe. And now it's those very same regimes which are arming the Israeli Defence Forces to create the carnage that we see in Gaza. Now, people talk about the war in Gaza. This is not a war, as we see in the Russian-Ukrainian conflict, where both sides have military forces that go beyond infantry. They've got missiles, rockets, tanks, you name it. What we see in Gaza is carnage. Before the 7th of October 2023, Gaza was the world's biggest prison. Over 2.3 million people had been confined to an area about the third size of Melbourne since 2016, when they elected Hamas as their government. And now, obviously, electing an organisation like Hamas comes from years of oppression. When Hamas broke out of the Gaza Strip on the 7th of October 2023, And the atrocities we saw that were committed by Hamas can be directly blamed on the oppression and the theft of land that had occurred in Palestine over the past 75 years. That doesn't justify it, but it gives you an understanding. Now, today, as I said before, this is not a war. Both sides don't have planes, both sides don't have tanks, both sides don't have missiles, both sides are not being supported by most of the so-called Western democracy in terms of arms as well as diplomatic recognition. It is nothing more than shooting fish in a barrel. And that's why, when you look at the 40,000 that are directly killed as a result of this carnage, a significant number of women and children. We're not talking about combatants blowing each other to bits. We're talking about the majority of the casualties being women and children. But what's more extraordinary is the fact that the organisations which have been set up to contain these conflicts are totally powerless. We saw the United Nations Security Council pass a resolution for an immediate ceasefire. Nothing. We see the President of the United States call for a ceasefire. Nothing. We see the International Criminal Court designate the Prime Minister of Israel a war criminal, as well as 2 or 3 Hamas operatives. We see the International Criminal Court make the decision that the occupation of East Jerusalem, Gaza and the West Bank is illegal under international law. Nothing. So no wonder there is so much hatred in the region. And while those fires are being stoked by countries like Australia, the United States, Germany, Britain, and the list goes on, that hatred will continue to fester, irrespective of whether there's a ceasefire or not, unless there is some type of solution, whether it's a one-state solution which incorporates both Palestinians and Israelis, or whether it's a two-state solution where the two sides cannot come to any agreement and 2 states are created. Now, obviously, in the state of Israel, the government continues the carnage because it has significant support among the Israeli people. Now, what Israel had going for it before this carnage was the fact that most people didn't understand what was happening in this part of the world, and because of the Holocaust, there was a great deal of sympathy for the Israeli state. The fact is that in 2024, that sympathy has evaporated. That's why we see more and more and more people going onto the streets to protest what's happening in Gaza. Whether we succeed or not is irrelevant. What is relevant, that people are showing the leaderships of these countries, including our own, that what is happening is totally unacceptable. Carnage is carnage. This is not war. It is not war, and to use the word war to describe what is happening is beyond belief. Now, this reminds me of 2 other situations which the West has been involved in. Well, there's many, but I just want to pick out 2. One was the Pol Pot regime, when the Vietnamese pushed Pol Pot to the extremities of Cambodia for the next 35 years. The Australian government, as well as the United States governments, recognised the Pol Pot faction has been legitimate owners of the Cambodian vote in the United Nations, despite the 2 million that had been died as a result of the Khmer Rouge's experiments during the early 70s. And again, let's not forget, the Pol Pot atrocities occurred as a direct consequence of United States intervention in Cambodia, where Cambodia was bombed into the Dark Ages, as well as Laos and Vietnam. And these regimes, these authoritarian regimes, scrambled out of the rubble and seized power. So we have a major issue. It's not an Israeli-Palestinian issue. It's much more than that. It's a worldwide issue. What is the world willing to accept in 2021? What is the Western world, which prides itself on this illusory concept, democracy and freedom, what is it willing to accept? Because the body count isn't just the 38 to 40,000 people that have died as a direct consequence of bullets and bombs. There are at least another 150,000 Gazans have died because they have not been able to access medical assistance, and because the living conditions are so atrocious that people are dying of preventable disease. The thing is about Carnage is the fact it's not just the direct impact, it's the indirect impact of not enough food, not enough water, not enough medicines, not enough health. You have to see just the pictures to see the indiscriminate destruction. Over 80% of buildings have been flattened in Gaza. Churches, mosques, hospitals, schools. And you may have noticed over the last few days there's a little bit of a rumble about the Australian War Cemetery in Gaza. Now, I'm sure most of you don't realise there is an Australian War Cemetery in Gaza as a result of the Australian Defence Forces battles against the Turks and the Ottoman Empire in World War I. I think there are thousands of Australians buried in the Gazan War Cemetery. Now, this war cemetery hasn't been touched until the bombing. Now, if the Russians or the Chinese had done this, I'm sure there would be questions asked. But because it's been done by the Israeli Defence Forces, nothing. Not a peep. A few words from the Australian minister responsible, and that's the end of the story. And that's why it's beyond comprehension and disbelief. Because the acceptance of a war criminal into the inner sanctum of the United States of America, which has been financing and providing the material which has resulted in the Gazan carnage, is unbelievable. But when you think about it, is it unbelievable? Is it unbelievable? Is it only totalitarian regimes which are involved in these types of atrocities? Or is there a long history of so-called Western democracy being involved in atrocities, whether it's in proxy wars, as we saw across the world in the 1970s and 1980s, the 2 million dead in Indonesia in the space of 2 months in the struggle against communism, the Malay emergency in our area, the 3 million dead in the Vietnam War, the recent invasion of Iraq by the coalition of the willing. Think about it. The atrocities which have been committed in South America, the United States backyard, in the 60s and 70s and 80s, when we had regimes like Pinochet regime in Chile, the regime in Argentina, Guatemala, where there were these proxy wars being fought. The same in Africa, in Angola, in Mozambique, parts of Northern Africa and Western Africa, where we continue to see these proxy wars. So for us to think that somehow we are different because we live in a Western-style parliamentary democracy, we are different to the authoritarian regimes. When push comes to shove, if you look at the history of the colonial settlements in this country, in North America and South America, when you look at the continuing millions, tens of millions which have died in this so-called struggle before the free world in a totalitarian world, you begin to understand that most societies, even those which are based on parliamentary principles, are nothing more than gangster societies. Because if we are willing to allow the carnage that's occurring in Gaza to continue unabated almost 9 months after it began, it highlights that we have learnt nothing from human history. So, think about it. Next time you see people running little bundles wrapped up in white cloth in Gaza, just think that's another child that's been killed in a conflict that they have no agency or control over. It's only us, through direct action, through joining the protest movement, by raising our voices, by talking to the parliamentarians, it's only us that can force the end to this conflict, as we saw in Washington when the President and the President in waiting and the alternative President welcomed a war criminal into the land of the brave and the free, while the so-called representatives of the brave and the free joined together the US Senate and the Congress to welcome and applaud a war criminal.